Now that we've uploaded data into the Data Hub, let's create a model for how we want to interact with and visualize that data using Connect. For this example, it'll be good to know what kind of data I've loaded into the system. I uploaded medical provider data. Medical provider data often comes in spreadsheets, and each row actually has two pieces of information we care about: a medical provider, a person that's a doctor or a nurse, and the building they practice at, which could be a hospital or some other facility like a private practice. Now, while this comes to us in rows and columns and may come in multiple spreadsheets with different column names, there'll be similar values, and the people we care about are persons and the facilities they practice at. Let's go draw a model for that now in Connect. In the Connect app, we start by creating a model. I'm going to call my model Providers because I'm going to be integrating the provider data I've uploaded into the Data Hub. And now I know that the key business concepts I care about interrogating are the buildings, the medical practices and the hospitals, and the people who work at them. So I'm going to add an entity called Person, because people practice at facilities, and I'm going to add one called Facility. I know a facility can be a hospital, a practice, and urgent care. And then I'm going to create a relationship between these. A person practices at a facility. What's excellent in the Data Hub is I can name my relationships. Now we'll set the cardinality here 1 to many because a person can practice at a hospital, an urgent care, private practice. We'll come back to the linking later. But creating our model is as simple as drawing circles and lines. And once we have the circles and lines, the next step really is to add the properties to these particular entities that we care about interrogating. We don't have to add all the properties from the data file, just the ones we want to be able to answer the business question we have at hand. And we can always come back and append and enrich the model later. And so we know for doctors, there's a national provider ID. And so they all have an MPI number. So we'll add that first. And we know there's a first name and a last name. And we know they practice at a particular site. So we're just going to call it Site ID here. We could give it a different name, but let's just call it Site ID. And I'm going to add a couple of other properties. Likewise for facility. Now we know the facility has a Site ID. And we know the facility has a name. It'll be the name of the hospital or the urgent care or practice. And that's it. Once we have the properties for our entities, the next step is to define those join keys. Now, if we go to the Info tab for an entity, you'll see two fields, Entity Identifier and Entity Label. Entity Identifier is, hey, what's going to identify a unique entity? And we're going to define uniqueness here by the MPI. So this National Provider ID is an ID, and it tells us, hey, if it's the same ID, it's the same person. And so this is just the key we're going to use to connect our data to a facility. But we need to know, hey, what are the unique objects that we're going to be connecting in the system? Then the entity label is really used for Explore. So when we visualize these results, we'll want to look at the last name in our visual view so we can quickly see which doctor works at which facility. Likewise for facility. We'll go to it. Now its identifier we'll say is the Site ID, because the Site ID identifies a unique facility. And its label will be the name. So we'll quickly be able to see the last name of a person that practices at a particular hospital or institution and have those names available to us in the graph view. Finally, for the relationship, once you've identified the entities, the relationships, the properties for the entities, and the IDs for those particular properties, you're now ready to go define the join keys for your relationships. So for practices at, we can highlight the relationship and hit the edit pencil, and we've defined the relationship. We know it's 1 to many, but the linking, we're going to join these on Site ID. These don't have to be the same name, but we know that the value in each is going to be equal, and that's what's going to allow us to link these into the default knowledge graph view within the MarkLogic Data Hub. And it's that simple. We've got our entities, our relationships, our properties, our join keys defined. Next, we move on to integrate data. So to review, when you go to Connect, first create a model and give it a meaningful name. Add entities and relationships to your canvas next. Think of these as the key business concepts you'll want to connect and be able to interrogate from your disparate data sources. Go define the properties for those entities. Now define an ID and label for those entities. The ID is going to be used, what is the uniqueness of this particular entity? What's the property I want to use to define uniqueness? And the label is what will be used in the entity instance in Explorer when we look at the graph view. Finally, go specify the join properties for those relationships by editing the relationship. And that's it. It's that simple. Next, we go integrate data and integrate.